Welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. We get the unfortunate topic of talking about mass violence this week. I am not a news program, not a journalist. I'm a licensed mental health professional. So, sort of my lens on this is like some of the mental health stuff, talking about prevention a little bit, we'll get to, and talking about some of the things that I think get missed by both mainstream media and basically anybody who's not actively studying and doing research around extremism, online extremism, is missing some of this stuff. We're still sort of 25 years late on this stuff. I mean, we're treating this like Columbine because the shooters referenced Columbine. So if you are unaware, recently, depending on when this episode goes out, a couple weeks ago, here in May 2026, there was a shooting in San Diego at the Islamic Center of San Diego, a mosque in San Diego. 3 people were killed, and the perpetrators ended up shooting themselves, not in that 3-person total. And I don't want to really get into a ton of the details. It does seem like the people who were shot did a lot to prevent this shooting from being a lot worse. And the 2 perpetrators were online pilled. I don't know how to talk about it without reverting to using some of the online language. But that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about why some of this meme culture, especially in alt-right spaces, is so problematic, why it works so well, specifically in those spaces, and what we should be talking about instead of hand-waving mental health randomly whenever there's a shooting. America is no longer the only place that school shootings and mass shootings of this type happen. We are just number one in frequency and intensity of it. It is a real problem here. We have way too many guns. We have no gun control, and we are bad at mental health. Now, I will say most places in the world at this exact moment are also bad at mental health. They just have way fewer guns. And so this is a problem. It continues to be a problem, but it's one of those things where people want to sort of approach this without the, I'm going to say, appropriate amount of nuance for how nuanced human beings are. There's a manifesto. Oh, the manifesto has this one reference that fits my preconceived notion of what school shooters are. Ta-da! And also thoughts and prayers, and hand wave the rest of it away. And that's why nothing changes. And I don't think a podcast by a therapist is going to change our culture. But for all the people who listen to this and tune in, hopefully we can learn something and have messaging that is backed by research and good prevention work, so that more people can be having good conversations about this that are actually productive instead of just confirmation bias and hand waving. So, welcome to the internet. So 2 shooters, both in high school, chronically online, people who were on Telegram. If you don't know what Telegram is, it's a Telegram channel. Telegram is a right-wing social media platform that, it's one of the things that fascists like to say where they're pro-free speech, but really in the fascist sense, they're only for their own free speech and limiting other people's. But this is the type of shit that would get you banned on other major social media platforms. No longer X, because that's cool with the alt-right specifically. So, but Telegram is if you study violent online extremism and if you study sort of these mass shootings tied to that, Telegram's going to pop up over and over and over again. It's been pretty linked to a lot of these things. And again, I think it's something where old heads like me knew what 4chan was, right? Like, if you know who Nick Fuentes is and Groypers are, like, they're called Groypers because of the Pepe the Frog meme. And you have to be pretty online, I think, to know some of that stuff. I don't necessarily consider myself to be online very often. I like to read books and be in nature. But also, as a millennial ADHDer, I do consume a lot of internet content very quickly, right? I'm not scrolling and scrolling and scrolling for hours a day, but I do tend to pick up a lot of this stuff just because I consume a lot of content every day from a ton of different places. And so some of this is just growing up in the internet age. I'm aware of some of the history here. And then it's through reading research on this stuff that I know some of the specifics. Because again, I was not a big 4chan user. I'm 37 going on 38, and I can barely handle like being on Discord. I find it to be overstimulating and not the internet version that I like. But like, I grew up on AOL Instant Messaging, and I remember the OG chat rooms of the internet. And again, like 4chan was a thing, and some of the like Flash websites that were edgy and problematic were also popular at a time where I was in high school as an angsty teenager, or in college as a bored college student who was probably chronically online at that point in my life. And so again, some of this stuff I'm familiar with enough to know what it was and what it's referencing to, but not necessarily because of regular use or being ever an active participant in any of this stuff. Again, I have a social media manager who runs most of my stuff because I don't really like social media, and I go on Reddit because you don't need to have an account to use it, because I don't actually want to interact with other people on the internet. So yeah, you sort of have to know some basics here. There was a big push at a certain time. In simpler times, we tried to moderate the tech fascists. So things like Facebook and what was then Twitter, I think a lot of it came from Twitter, honestly, because Twitter was sort of always the cesspool of social media. And when Twitter went to, hey, we're going to moderate hate speech, which is like good, correct, that should happen. And if these billion-dollar entities, the social media algorithm owners, Musk, Zuckerberg, those types, should be held to account for this. They should have safeguards and things on their platforms. And depending on how old you are when you're listening to this, there was a simpler time where these things started to happen. Now, I can be critical of all of the implementation of that because the censorship was always very poorly done. If you go on Instagram now in 2026 and you follow a sex educator, they're going to talk about how they're being silenced and their stuff's being relegated to the back rooms, and the algorithm is very unfriendly to people who use the word sex. And so if you're a sex educator and you're trying to give people good science-backed information, you're going to get censored. But again, you can go on Twitter and be an outright neo-Nazi and nothing happens. So the censorship has always been poorly doled out because it's always been sort of about perception of media, and I would say like just culture in general. It's always been sort of this idea of it needs to look like we're doing a good job more than like, oh, there are people who study this professionally and they're experts and we have a ton of research on how this should go. Like the word suicide shouldn't be censored. And it is. A ton of my stuff is not algorithm friendly because I refuse to not do the thing that's backed by research, which is to use the actual terms you're supposed to be using. If you're a sex educator, you know that using the anatomically correct terminology is helpful to avoid confusion for people when you're doing education about sex. If you're working with suicide prevention, you know that you're supposed to use the word suicide and you're supposed to talk about it very sort of neutrally, not blunt shock value, but like, yeah, people sometimes think about killing themselves. And What do we do with that is what prevention work tackles, not what words should we tiptoe around. Talking about it directly and specifically is helpful to avoid confusion. We need words as, people. It's one of the things we do. We use words. Our language matters. And so yeah, there was a time where content moderation increased, and right-wingers really outed themselves as fascist then. I mean, we're now declaring, at least here in America, declaring anti-fascists to be terrorists, which would make the fascists the good guys. So again, they have fully outed themselves. But this was, earlier times. Some of the early Trump rhetoric for Trump's first presidential run was going on around that time. And so a bunch of people got mad about this because their hate-filled fascist views were being censored. And they started things like Rumble and Telegram. And the free speech absolutists wanted little spaces where they could go be sort of tiny tyrants of their own little fiefdoms and pretend that they had free speech just because you could say slurs. And from that, a bunch of sort of sub-communities were born. And so 4chan went through this, then it became 8chan, and it has sort of filtered out to other things. Telegram, there's a Telegram channel about mass shootings. It has really sort of become its own thing. I'm interested in this. I read research on this. I am not necessarily the go-to expert on this. I read other experts on this stuff. It is just one of my hyper focuses, so I happen to know a lot about it. I don't claim to be an active researcher or an expert on the topic. Again, it is something that I know a lot about because I pay attention to it and read a lot of the current research on it, and I'm also a mental health professional. So, yeah, there's a whole lore now, and the in-group, out-group dynamics that we see in a lot of social settings are really there. Knowing a lot about mass shootings, they have sort of a sainthood on the Telegram collective, which assigns points. We're talking about the memeification of mass violence, but there's also like the gamification of it, that there's points for where a mass shooting is carried out, how many people are killed, what race or gender the people are. It's like all very gross and dehumanizing. But where this sort of comes up is there is an in-group, out-group dynamic that is really strong. And then there's a hierarchical structure that gets attached to it. And so all the worst things of our society distilled into the space that's really designed to take sort of outcasts and loners and give them a place to find community. And that community is around acting out against other people violently. And the gamification of this matters. And the memeification of this media matters a ton, which we'll jump into now. I do not think, and it's not my personal opinion, it is my personal opinion, and that is informed by research, that playing violent video games does not make people more violent. I don't think that participating with the internet inherently makes people more violent. I don't think sharing memes necessarily makes people more violent. One of the things that I think mainstream media and a lot of folks, even like independent journalists, get wrong about this stuff is they want to create a cause and effect. And with social dynamics, it's just really hard to do that. Humans in mass are very easy to predict. Humans individually are nearly impossible to predict because that variability just skyrockets about what this is all about. And so we're looking for things that desensitize people who are also at risk for acting out in violent ways. And so like teenagers are pretty much in increased risk for nearly everything. Their brains are awash in a ton of chemicals, and their brains are not fully formed yet. And it's just a weird sort of stage of development. They are more likely to do risky behaviors. They're more likely to act out socially. They're more likely to engage in unsafe substance use. They're more likely to engage in unsafe sex. They're more likely to pretty much do anything that is unsafe simply because their brain is at a certain time and place where it struggles to think through all of the long-term consequences, and they don't necessarily have the lived experience to make a good decision. And they're very impulsive because of their brain chemistry. And again, that's in general true of all teenagers. That doesn't mean that every teenager is an increased risk. Social isolation is the other big risk here that fits sort of this pattern of how does somebody who maybe is chronically online go from being just a weird chronically online sort of incel coded person to being an actual incel who wants to carry out violence. Because again, not all of them do. 4chan was a very busy website, right? Like some of these things have hundreds of thousands of users, and a small percentage of them actually carry out violence. A lot of people participate in the in-group dynamics of being part of these communities, knowing the memes, sharing the memes, doing the lols together, and they won't carry out any violence, right? And so there's nuance in there are multiple factors that need to line up for this to happen. And even with those factors lining up, it's not a guarantee that somebody will be violent. But there's almost always a ton of warning signs. And if we're looking for those risk factors that are contributing to it, it does make prevention a lot easier. So we have the gamification of this stuff, right? The point system, the sainthood, really dehumanizes people, actual real living, breathing people, into point systems. This is the thing that happens in video games. Again, I think there is a comfort for a lot of people in knowing what is normal and doing what they are comfortable with. And if you play a lot of video games, if you're doing first-person shooters and other things, you get comfortable with this idea. And again, not everybody who plays sort of a violent or over-the-top video game is going to enact violence. For some people, having that fantasy play out is soothing for them. For some people, processing their emotions through something sort of mindless that isn't real and doesn't have actual stakes is also very soothing for them. So there's a swath of the population, I would argue a majority of the population, who can do things like that, play violent video games, and never translate any of that into the real world. There's a percentage of them who that's actually really good for. And then there's a small percentage of people who that becomes very desensitizing for. And they lean into it, right? It's not just a silly little game. It's not just a metaphor. It's not just whatever. It becomes, I also want to assign points to people. And so there have been a bunch of offensive games. There was some sort of road rally game where running over pedestrians got you different types of points. And if you're an edgy little teenager to appreciate the shock value and say, haha, I'm going to send this to my friend who will also laugh at it, that creates a small sort of in-group dynamic right there. But again, it's a stretch then to say every teenager is going to start going out and hitting people with their cars. We just know that simply is not true. And so it's not always a causal effect, but there are people who are going to play a game like that and also then go on to an online server and chat with other people about the dehumanization of other people, about how low IQ people are, or people who have less value, and their brain is going to be desensitized playing this violent video game, and then their brain is actually going to be activated in assigning points and scores and value to people. And there, so it's the desensitization through the game, but also like the activation through the participation of devaluing people's lives. Again, there's an ethos to saying some people are high value and some people are low. And the value we ascribe to someone, like the wild, I think, ego you have to say, I get to choose that. And then to want to like actually enact that and say, we should get rid of the low value people. And again, that mixes the metaphors a little bit. English is tricky because again, they're used to assigning value on a point system, the gamification of it. They can also then go and participate in an actual real ethos that assigns value to people or not. And so something like Terragram has then the point system, but also has the sainthood. And so where the memeification comes in is there creates sort of a lingo, an in-group conversational aspect to, going ER, which is a reference to Elliot Rogers, and who's a mass murderer who was had a mass shooting event and then killed himself. Sort of the Anders Breivik, the Christchurch shooting. They're people who do mass violence get quote unquote sainted. And again, I think for people who are outcasts or struggling for some reason, maybe it's mental health, maybe it's an undiagnosed neurodivergence, maybe it's just being weird or not really being comfortable in yourself, maybe it's normal teen angst, maybe it's anxiety, whatever it is, right? Struggling to fit in, you find this community that's sort of niche information, and the human brain likes feeling like it knows things that other people don't. And then it's also that in-group out-group dynamic. If you're an out-group where you're not quite a nerd, you're not a jock, and you're not a cool kid, and whatever other sort of high schooly tropes exist where you feel like you're an out everywhere, and then you find this in-group, it's built to sort of reward people who are socially ostracized, and then the dynamics that make people stick with something like this are pretty strong. And we know with like incel culture, one of the things that works best for people to not be incels is to have friends in real life. Right? It's really hard to be an incel if you're dating someone for real, because all of the communication, the in-group out-group dynamics gets cut through by somebody who's not in the in-group really mattering to you. And so a relationship in real life is one of those things that really matters. And so but that in-group dynamic is self-referential and self-rewarding. And so we have sort of black pilled, we have griper, we have, if you saw the Netflix show Adolescence, which was emotionally a fantastic show and wildly unrealistic in pretty much every other way. But it really hit the emotional beat pretty well. And it was shot in a phenomenal way. I mean, like from a technical standpoint, that show was phenomenal. I personally really liked it. I haven't talked about it publicly anywhere because I think a lot of it was really inaccurate, actually. But it did a good job of pulling the heartstrings. But Adolescence has some stuff where the police or school counselors, I don't remember who it was, and this kid's parents are all looking at social media and being like, people like his stuff. They're posting nice things. They're putting these emojis. And then some other kid was like, no, this emoji's making fun of him. This emoji saying he's never going to get laid. This emoji saying he's black pilled. Like there was all this sort of slang around the pills, rope. There's this lingo that exists for the sainthood type stuff. And so these two perpetrators of the shooting at the Islamic Center of San Diego were into all of this stuff. It's in their manifesto. The manifesto seems to be really like choppy and cut up. Not like they ChatGPT'd it. It does seem like they wrote it, but that they really like copy and pasted. Like some of the, again, if you know meme culture, there's this sort of idea of like microwaving and having these like fried out memes where the colors are all wrong and it's a really sort of washed image. That's almost what they did with the manifesto. But I think, again, when you're talking about meme culture, it doesn't need to be particularly logically sound or coherent. Memes are, researchers will sort of talk about like hot messaging and cold messaging. Memes are cold messaging that it's vibes based, right? And so this idea of good communication, research, journalism, if it's done well, for both of those things, right, is going to have facts and data that are replicatable in different settings, and it's going to have in internal consistency. Memes are not that. Memes are vibes based, and again, I've said the term coded. I think I said incel coded and black pills and some of this other stuff. which is again like a weird sort of internet cultural phenomenon where like, right, you very rarely grammatically need to say something is coded away. You can just say it's the thing, and like coded already makes sense for that. I don't know. Anyway, so they sort of cherry picked bits of the manifesto. It's almost incoherent, but in a way where I think the irony of meme culture is that doesn't matter. They're not posting something for internal consistency. They're not sharing an actually well thought out ethos. They're copy and pasting things for sort of social in group points for somebody to, put the Chris Evans gif that says I understood that reference up. Like that in real life, that's sort of what their brains are trying to do, of saying, let's see how much in-group sort of lingo, how much cultural slang that signifies I'm one of you gets to exist, because then even when I kill myself, I'll be remembered, and that matters. Again, like this idea of sainthood is sort of religion has it too, and I'll besmirch religion very comfortably, but our fear of sort of our own mortality and death, this idea of wanting to live forever, is a very non biological sort of thing. It's sort of our brains struggling to deal with their own mortality. And so again, the paradoxical nature of we're going to murder suicide and then also live forever, there's such a sort of weird convoluted thought process involved in that again, I don't think a 17 and 18-year-olds who are chronically online are really thinking through. It doesn't matter whether it's internally consistent or not. It matters that it passes the vibe check. And it's really sad in a way that anyone thinks this way. Our current president sure does. I think that's because he's very stupid and at this point very demented. He's real deep into the brain decay. Years of uppers will do that. And didn't start with a lot to begin with. Like Musk, we know, is chronically online. And so again, money and fame and power doesn't insulate you from these things. I mean, Trump and Musk are deeply unlikable and probably social outcasts, even in their wealthy class that they get to participate in, which makes them susceptible to this stuff. But it's sad that people whose brains are not fully formed, who haven't had much life experience, get pulled into these things. And again, want to enact violence on unrelated people for reasons that are not even like their own personal ethos. The idea that they're going to be doing violence to Muslims because they read a bunch of anti-Islam rhetoric from a previous school shooter, when they're all over the place with their own sort of ethos. And again, I'm not saying there's like a defensible way to have an ethos where you get to go kill other people, but like culture thinks that. There's how many genocides going on in the world right now, and there are people who are defending them based on a ethos, whether that is a religion or that is a firmly held belief of some sort of ancestry or right or might makes right or some idea of ownership of land or whatever it is. It's eugenics, it's fascism, it's authoritarianism, whatever is sort of the idea. There's a bunch of people who defend really horrific shit because of an ethos. And I'm just suggesting, I'm not saying it's good. I'm suggesting that people whose brains haven't completely finished developing yet and who lack lived experience to increase and broaden that development aren't well set up to avoid falling into this shit. And so again, some of it is teen brains and some of it is life stage development. They're very, very well-developed, mature brains before they get out of high school, right? There are people who have that level of brain development early because, again, it's not a number thing, but that's through lived experiences. That's through, their own personal lived experiences, allowing for that brain growth and development to happen. Some of that is likely genetics. Some of that is definitely the environment they're raised in. So there's all these factors that go into it. But we also know like the brain rot of the internet does stunt some development. And so we have people who were unlikely to have fully developed brains getting into this stuff probably years ago, right? I don't know that you can even find your way to Telegram if it's like new to you. I'm sure you can. But it's not simple. It's not like quick little Google search. There's some depth to sort of the rabbit holes you have to go down to find this stuff. Again, like the dark web, exists. And if you're tech savvy, you can get there. And also like, I don't know, I'm not that tech savvy. So again, it's something that people might know about, but not necessarily meaning that it's accessible to every single person. And the point isn't to necessarily keep people from all of this stuff. I'm a mental health professional. I'm fairly desensitized to certain topics, especially related to mental health. Like clients sometimes send me like suicide jokes. And like, I respond by saying, you shouldn't send that to your therapist. I send dark humor to some of my friends, some of my inner circle who will understand the irony or satire associated with it. But some of this stuff with the memeification of it like loses sight that it's irony or satire. Again, that's born out of personal experience and other people's experiences and like a certain degree of, I don't want to say like earned cynicism, but sort of. And it doesn't mean like, again, I think there's a way where you can look at all that's dark and heavy in the world and have some humor about it. And that can be soothing and calming for some people. And I think you can look at all that's dark and heavy in the world and get mad about it and take it personally. And that usually goes poorly. And so the memes, again, are a desensitization process where it's not that everybody who's exposed to these memes is going to enact violence. It's a factor in how this might impact somebody who is a risk already for violence. And it takes something, it lacks the internal consistency. So it doesn't need to be well thought out or logical. It doesn't really require much thinking at all. And again, having an ethos like every person deserves to live. Every human is deserving of love. Every human is deserving of basic respect, which includes safety and shelter and food and water. Like, again, that's questionable that everyone believes that. So again, I don't think you have to be like bad or broken to be struggling with a coherent ethos. And the memeification bypasses needing an ethos. You don't actually need to engage your thinking brain in it. It's just, I got that reference, little light up for reward process in the brain. And that desensitization continues then. The more that you're exposed to these things, the more that you think in sort of low stakes, almost nihilistic irony. It's not highbrow satire. I don't know if satire can be highbrow. Certainly not in our modern landscapes. Satire is dead. But yeah, it's not like funny because it's subversive. It's sort of edgelord nonsense. And again, I think people know that. I think mainstream media knows that. I think people sort of are aware of like, oh, it's edgy teenage bullshit. And I think that follows up with they'll grow out of it. But again, not everybody does, right? It's a question of what sort of inoculates you from going further down that rabbit hole. Because if that is the only in-group you have and you keep getting rewarded for being that in-group and you keep being punished for being out-group everywhere else, quote unquote punished, right? If the perception is of that, that you're alienated in normal social spaces, normal in quotes there, typical, whatever. And then you're rewarded for this sort of niche online subculture that is very violent and extremist, you're going to keep going back to it. And so the question becomes, how do we sort of create spaces for people where that doesn't happen? And again, the hand waving that happens with mental health is a really big problem, because it doesn't allow for actually solving some of these very solvable problems. We could have more accessible third spaces for people in general, but specifically young people, to meet and congregate and socialize. Because again, in real life relationships help people from being pulled into online extremism. Where are we going to relate to people? Well, if you're not in the school play and you're not in school sports, end of list. Maybe you're going to get a job, but maybe not. Doesn't probably pay well. And unless you're like trying to escape a bad home life, or your parents are really strict about getting a job, like there's not a huge push for that. And there's perhaps not good social safety net there either. Being a minimum wage high school student working somewhere isn't inherently something that's going to keep you from some of this stuff. You could go work in a restaurant as a busboy or whatever, and you're going to be exposed to the drug use of the line cooks, and then you're going to, maybe that's good, and somebody is telling you to read, I don't know, whatever, have an ethos. Or maybe somebody is, nihilistically cynical and negative and gets you on some sort of black pill, Joe Rogan adjacent bullshit. And so again, like, where do people get to belong? Well, we need more spaces. It doesn't take my brain long to say, well, this is possible, but here's like the more shittier, more likely outcome, because late stage capitalism really sucks at having space to congregate. And so how do we get to build community if there is no space for that? How can we have a sense of belonging if there is no space for that? School isn't a good fit for every kid's brain. We know this. And we also know that society, which school is trying to prep people for, isn't good for everyone's brain. So where do those people go? And again, there's a ton of options. I'm not asking rhetorically of like, oh no, this is a problem that has no solution. I'm asking like, right, do they go play D&D? Do they find a different hobby? Like what community can exist for them? And then what are the barriers of them participating in that community? Do they need to have a car? Do they need to have money? Like what's getting in the way of that? Again, I think about like board games. I mean, I have some really expensive board games, but like pretty low entry costs. I go disc golfing, pretty low entry cost. Music is a community thing. It's a thing I've talked about with a bunch of people recently. So it's not like it's not work. There are communities that are accessible, just limited, and it is some degree of work to connect with them, especially if you're somebody who's like a high school kid who's spending 8-9 hours at a place that you feel like you don't fit in. That is tough. And going home and going on whatever neo-Nazi sort of posting board thing exists, if you're if you know what Atomwaffen is and you're posting their symbols on your shit, like you've been online for too long. That's not a typical place to land. And so we do need places for belonging, and we do need space for that, and that is part of what I think centrists, I mean, right-wingers, like, this is a good thing, right? They want violent extremists. For centrists and corporate bought liberals, neolibs, I think it's convenient to blame mental health, but then to not want to change anything, because that would require changing sort of our social setup, where we spend a bunch more money on a bunch more of community-based things. And it's not capitalism. It's not shareholders increasing their own stock value. It is spending money on people because people are worthwhile. Again, we would have to shift our sort of cultural paradigm for something like that to happen. I also think people miss, because it's not inherently logical, and I think if you're not aware of sort of the subculture, it's not easily accessible. things like memes become cultural currency. There's transactional nature to them. And so it's not just content you're consuming. It's not just the desensitization. It's the reward process of, it's a signifier that I am in the in group. And by doing certain things and being ironic or black-pilled or edgy about them, you are getting to participate in the reward system of, look, I'm in group, and now people liked it, people reposted it, people laughed at it, people whatever. And so it doesn't require thought or engagement to get thumbs up or reposts or hearts or whatever else. The edginess covers the vulnerability of, I want to feel connected. And so again, this becomes cultural currency. If you have listened to a lot of my stuff, you've probably heard me talk about Marshall McLuhan before, who wrote The Medium is the Massage. It's one of my coffee table books. It's one of my permanent coffee table books. It's always out and in my office because I reference it regularly, which is sort of this idea that media is always sort of constantly working us over. And the medium, the form by which information is shared, is already doing work to create meaning. And so again, if you're on a Telegram channel, if you're on Discord, if you're on 4chan, if you're on a certain subreddit, if you are in some sort of internet subculture, that's already creating meaning reflexively. And then it is also sort of priming you to create more meaning by engaging with that medium. And so it's desensitization to things like dehumanization and violence. And then it's, again, that activation process. It's cultural currency. It's transactional interactions, which are replacing real relationships by sort of distilling it down to its sort of like basic, almost most primal. It's not even like but it's like synthetic, right? It's not primal as in organic. It's like base. It's again, even that becomes like language on like, oh, that's based. Again, being like anti-woke is like, I would like to be asleep. Again, so much of it is for anybody who's trying to apply critical thinking to it, it's very frustrating. It's like, well, this is so obviously stupid and hypocritical. But again, that's part of like the in-group, out-group dynamic is like, oh, this person takes it seriously, so they're stupid. There's like that vapid edginess to it that serves as almost always a defense. I didn't mean it. I was just joking. It's ironic. And again, this has been normalized at the presidential level through Trump. And so again, we have an incredibly stupid person who is interested in sort of very basic, simplistic concepts where they can post AI images and memes and they can say it was a staffer. And then 2 weeks later, they can say, no, it was me all along. And nothing happens because it is devoid of meaning except for the messaging to the in-group. And so, yeah, it's like maddening. And again, the idea of like, if you're a therapist who's listening, if you're a parent who's listening, what do I do, right? The goal isn't necessarily to keep kids from everything. Again, the Streisand effect will sort of kick in there where if you try and ban something, you're probably going to draw more attention to it. You're not going to be able to block the internet out for your kid. Again, technology advances too quick, and every generation that is a tech native becomes better and better at using it versus the old generations. So should you be aware of what your kid is doing and where they're spending time online? Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. But the goal of that isn't necessarily to block it. The goal is to have some conversations, to try and engage for critical thinking, to create some of those neural networks that question some of these things, to understand sort of what the ethos is and where they feel a sense of belonging. Again, if they're spending a ton of time online and it's like, I don't know, their Minecraft server and like it's kids they've known since they were 12 years old and they, like to still get together and play Minecraft together, like that's cool. If it's a Minecraft server and they're building, I don't know, swastikas and SS symbols and whatever other bullshit they're pulling in because they're tiny little fascists and they feel edgy with their little group, well, like then that's much larger cause for concern, right? And so we need to sort of, again, be able to engage our own critical thinking and have nuance with some of these things. What are the risk factors here and what reduces the risk, right? It's not just like ban the risk, right? You can't just block stuff and be like, no, my kid's safe. That isn't how it works. So, yeah. engaging the critical thinking, creating neural networks, right? Like making them think through stuff, thinking beyond just sort of the vapid flattening of meaning that memes and meme culture can do. I think it's one of those things that gets really lost in the shuffle when we're sort of talking about these topics. It's really easy to say that's stupid or childish, they'll grow out of it. And again, like to actually connect the dots and say, what replaces that meaning? Let's think through that critically. What does that actually mean? Because what these groups do well is they create a sense of mattering, they belonging. There's the meaning making process, and you belong, are really powerful. And then also like the reward system after being vulnerable is really powerful. So my dog just came downstairs and is panting. It is warm here in Wisconsin suddenly. Yeah, I don't want to spend a ton of time on the shooting specifically because I'm not a journalist. I will say the names of the victims and not the shooters. There are three victims. One was the security guard who, again, I think I mentioned this earlier when I was sort of giving a quick summary of it, did a lot to lead the shooters away, started the lockdown, initialized the lockdown protocol that the mosque had in place. It's really shitty that we live in a time and a place where kids have to practice active shooter drills. But in this case, they followed those protocols and saved a bunch of kids because of it. His name was Amin Abdullah. He's 51 years old. There was Imam, a teacher named Nadir Awad, who's 57, and Mansour Kaziha, who was 78-year-old caretaker who had been with the mosque since it opened in the 80s. And the security guard returned fire to the shooters is what I saw in current reporting. Again, it's possible by the time this comes out, some of this will be updated. And the two other victims were on the property, but not where those shooters were, and actually ran towards the shooting, again, to try and help people and keep the kids safe. And so very brave actions, tragic that these things are necessary. Again, for shooters that didn't really seem to be, it'll go down as a hate crime and it'll be processed that way. But again, I think it's more complicated than that because some of their stuff was white supremacy, and some of their stuff was edgelord bullshit, and some of this stuff was anti-gay and homophobic stuff, and some of this stuff was anti-Semitic, and like the manifesto is all over the place. Because again, I think it's not about meaning making, it's about signaling to an in-group. And so that's why I sort of wanted to hop on and talk about this. There's shootings all the time that I don't talk about, but I think this is a good example where people are going to say, oh, there's a manifesto, oh, it says this, it fits the sort of preconceived notion. And understanding that like the lack of actual meaning, I keep going back to like the vapid nature of it all, is like, yes, there's no substance to this, and that sort of is the point, but that also creates a space where something like this is going under the radar and not being criticized and not being sort of kept tabs of. Again, I'm not somebody who's like police everything. I wish that moderation on the internet did look a lot different than it did, but I wish there was, that was backed by data and research, not the whims of an angsty public, or certainly not the man children that own these sort of algorithms. So it's not about policing per se, but it is about informed decision making and reducing harm and reducing risk. And so certainly I think understanding some of what the modern extremism looks like, it's nonsensical on purpose. Again, I think irony can be, and there can be an art to irony, and that's not what this is. Again, this is super lowbrow, sort of lowest common denominator type bullshit. And I think it really serves to attract a certain type of undeveloped or underdeveloped brain. Again, it's not just teenagers who fall for this stuff. Like Joe Rogan fell for this stuff, and Joe Rogan has certainly served an important point in laundering some of this ideology as a starting point into getting into some of the more extreme nonsense by platforming some of the conspiracy thinkers and some of the other people who have also been problematic in this. So again, not a super fun topic to get to jump into, but something that I think is interesting, something I think people who don't necessarily look into this stuff, maybe aren't up to date on this stuff, something that I think comes up often of like, what do I do? Right? I have an 8 and a 5-year-old, and like their internet access is super, 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 super limited. I'm thinking even now, like when they don't really have access to the internet, but that's because we put all these parameters on things like the PlayStation on their tablets. They can't get online with their tech because of their ages. And as they age, that will have to shift and change. And again, it's as a parent, you don't have to prevent every bad thing from happening, but you have to be aware of sort of what the risks are, and you have to have a plan for how you're managing that, and you have to be able to communicate clearly and effectively to your kids about that. So again, it's you as a parent need to be informed, and you're trying to work to help the kids developing brains connect and grow. And maybe, like, again, you don't have an 8-year-old, maybe you have like a nephew who's a 30-year-old who listens to black pill content, and like, right, again, it's not an age thing that they grow out of, it's a development thing. Not everybody develops the way that we would wish by the time they turn 18. There's nothing magical about that number. So yeah, I think this stuff's interesting. Yeah, so that's what I got. If you want more stuff like this, I have an interview with Spencer Sunshine on the podcast. I listen to Weird Little Guys podcast. I'll freely plug Molly Conger and her work. As somebody who studies religious trauma, there's a ton of overlap between right-wing Christo-fascist type ideology and a lot of this extremism on the internet. And so it's sort of where I found a lot of that stuff. Like, I have Blood and Politics on my bookshelf. Like, Bring the War Home. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that I don't know that is stuff that everyday sort of people enjoy reading. But here we are. It's affecting us again. Another mass shooting and another really oversimplified take on what are some of the causes of it. And yeah, I don't know. I think we need to navigate it better. So that's what I've got for us today. I've got some cool guests coming up. If you're a local, I'll be at Pride Fest here in Milwaukee. You can come on down to that and say hi. I will be dressed as Jesus, so it should be easy to spot. We are raising some funds for supporting religious trauma survivors. I'm running a retreat in August 14th through the 16th. So we'll be taking donations for that. I already have some funding secured for that. So we're going to try and get some the rest of that thing paid for, so I can do full scholarships for everyone, but at least we have partial scholarships at this point. And we will also be taking signups down at Pride, and there will be information about that stuff on my website shortly. Probably by the time this episode airs, you can go on my website if you want to donate. If you're not a local and can't come see me at Pride, you'll be able to donate through a link at the website. If you want to sign up, there will be more information at my website, which is wellnesswithjared.com. So yeah, check that stuff out. Cool stuff happening in real life and online. I will be back next week with a new episode. Take care, everyone. Peace.